I pulled into my driveway after a brutal 12-hour shift at the manufacturing plant in Toledo, Ohio, only to find two vehicles blocking my path with red and blue flashing lights mounted on their dashboards. My exhaustion instantly transformed into confusion and then irritation as I sat there in my truck, engine idling, staring at what looked like an impromptu traffic stop happening right in front of my own house. It was nearly 11 at night, and all I wanted was to park, grab some leftover pizza from the fridge, and collapse into bed. The two vehicles were a silver Honda Accord and a white Ford Explorer, both civilian cars with those cheap, magnetic emergency lights that you can buy online stuck to their roofs. Two people stood between the vehicles, holding flashlights and wearing neon yellow vests that said HOA Patrol across the back in bold black letters. I recognized one of them immediately as Patricia Whitmore, the Homeowners Association president who had made my life miserable since I moved into Riverside Meadows 3 years ago. The other was a younger woman I had seen at HOA meetings but never actually spoken to. I honked my horn twice, a polite request to move so I could access my own property. Patricia turned around slowly, deliberately shining her flashlight directly into my windshield. I squinted against the glare and honked again, this time holding it a bit longer. She made no move to relocate the vehicles. Instead, she started walking toward my truck with her flashlight still pointed at my face. I rolled down my window as she approached. "Patricia, I need to get into my driveway. Can you move your cars?" "Mr. Zimmerman," she said, drawing out my last name like it was an accusation. "Do you know what time it is?" "Yeah, it's late, which is exactly why I want to park and go inside my house. We're conducting official HOA business here. There have been reports of suspicious activity in this neighborhood, and we're monitoring the situation." I glanced past her at the other woman who was now writing something on a clipboard. "Suspicious activity? What kind of suspicious activity?" "That's HOA business, Eric. Confidential information that we share only with authorized personnel." The way she emphasized my first name made my jaw clench. "Okay, well, this is my driveway and you're blocking it. I'm asking you nicely to move." "We'll move when we're done with our patrol," Patricia said, crossing her arms over her vest. "This is a matter of community safety, which takes priority over your convenience." I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure despite the exhaustion weighing down every muscle in my body. "Patricia, you can't just block someone's driveway. That's illegal." "We're authorized HOA officers conducting official business," she replied, tapping the badge clipped to her vest. It looked like something from a costume shop, a cheap gold-colored shield with HOA officer engraved on it. "We have every right to be here." "HOA officers?" I repeated, my fatigue giving way to disbelief. "You're not actual officers. You're the president of a homeowners association." Patricia's expression hardened. "We have jurisdiction over all common areas and the authority to enforce community regulations. If you have a problem with that, you can file a complaint at the next board meeting. This isn't a common area. This is my driveway, my property." Actually, according to Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA bylaws, all driveways are subject to HOA oversight and regulation. We can access any driveway when conducting official business. I had read those bylaws front to back when I bought the house, and I was pretty sure that wasn't what they said. "I don't think that's accurate. Are you questioning my knowledge of the regulations I helped write?" Patricia's voice rose slightly. "I've been on this board for 15 years, Mr. Zimmerman. I know these bylaws better than anyone." The other woman had stopped writing and was now filming me with her phone. I could see the red recording light glowing in the darkness. "Great. Just great." Look, I said, trying a different approach. I've been working since 7 this morning. I'm tired. Can we please just resolve this quickly so I can park my truck and go inside? You should have thought about that before you decided to come home during a security operation, Patricia said. Now, I'm going to need to see your identification and vehicle registration. I stared at her. You want to see my ID? Why? To verify that you're a resident of this community and that this is indeed your property. You know who I am, Patricia. You've been sending me violation notices for 3 years. Protocol requires identification verification during any HOA interaction, she said, holding out her hand expectantly. This was absurd. I was sitting in my own truck, in front of my own house, being asked for ID by someone who had absolutely no legal authority to request it. But I also knew that Patricia was the type of person who would escalate any situation if she didn't get her way. I had seen her call actual police on neighbors for minor disputes at least twice since I moved in. I'm not showing you my ID, I said firmly. You're not a law enforcement officer, and you have no right to demand identification from me. Patricia's face flushed red, visible even in the dim light from the street lamps. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have no choice but to issue a violation notice and fine you for obstruction of HOA business. Fine me for being blocked from entering my own driveway. The ridiculousness of the situation was almost funny, except it wasn't funny at all because I knew she was completely serious. Fine you for failure to comply with a lawful HOA directive, Patricia corrected. That's a $200 penalty for the first offense. I rubbed my eyes, trying to think through the fog of exhaustion. This woman was threatening to fine me because I wouldn't show her my ID while she was illegally blocking my driveway with fake emergency lights. The whole situation felt surreal, like I had driven into some bizarre alternate reality where HOA board members had morphed into wannabe cops. Patricia, those lights on your cars, I said, pointing at the flashing red and blue beacons. Those are illegal. Civilians can't use emergency lights like that in Ohio. These are authorized safety equipment for HOA patrol purposes, she replied without missing a beat. We're not impersonating anyone. We're clearly marked as HOA personnel. Those lights make you look like police officers. That's impersonation of law enforcement. Patricia laughed, and sharp sound that cut through the quiet night. Don't be ridiculous. We're simply using appropriate safety lighting while conducting our patrols. There's nothing illegal about it. The other woman spoke up for the first time. Maybe you should just show us your ID, sir. Then we can all move on. What's your name? I asked her. She hesitated, glancing at Patricia before answering. Melissa Hoffman. I'm the HOA secretary. Well, Melissa, I'm not showing anyone my ID because nobody here has the authority to ask for it. And I'd appreciate it if you'd stop recording me. We have the right to document all HOA interactions, Patricia interjected. It's for our records and protection. I realized this conversation was going nowhere. These two women had decided they were some kind of neighborhood police force, and no amount of logic or reason was going to change their minds tonight. I needed a different strategy. All right, I said, pulling out my own phone. Since you're documenting this, I'm going to do the same. I started recording video, making sure to capture the flashing lights, the HOA patrol vests, and both women's faces. Patricia immediately moved closer to my truck, trying to block my phone's camera with her hand. You can't record us without our permission, she said. Actually, I can. We're in public, and Ohio is a one-party consent state. I don't need your permission to record anything happening in plain view on a public street. This is HOA business. You're interfering with official, it's not official anything, I interrupted, my patience finally snapping. You're not cops. You're not security guards. You're volunteers on a homeowners association board, and right now you're blocking my driveway with illegal emergency lights and harassing me when I'm trying to get home from work." Patricia's mouth formed a tight line. "That's it. I'm filing a formal complaint with the board. You'll be facing multiple fines and possible further action." "You do that," I said, continuing to record. "And I'm going to file a report with the actual police about this whole situation." "For what?" Patricia scoffed. "We haven't done anything wrong." "For starters, impersonating law enforcement with those lights. For blocking my driveway. For harassment. Should I keep going?" Melissa looked nervous now, shifting her weight from foot to foot. "Patricia, maybe we should just move the cars." "We're not done here," Patricia said, but I could hear a slight waver in her voice now. The mention of involving real police had clearly affected her confidence. "I'm calling the police right now," I said, pulling up my phone's dial pad while keeping the camera rolling. "We can let them sort this out." "You're overreacting," Patricia said quickly. "There's no need to involve the police in a simple HOA matter. You're the ones playing dress-up cop with fake badges and illegal lights. I think the police would be very interested in this simple HOA matter." I dialed 911 and put the phone on speaker. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. "911. What's your emergency?" "Hi, I'm at 847 Riverside Drive in the Riverside Meadows subdivision. I'm being blocked from entering my driveway by two people claiming to be HOA officers. They have vehicles with red and blue flashing lights and are demanding to see my identification." "Are they in official vehicles?" the dispatcher asked. "No, they're civilian vehicles with what look like emergency lights attached to them. The people are wearing vests that say HOA Patrol." There was a pause. "So these are not actual police officers?" "No, madam, they're members of the homeowners association." "And they're preventing you from accessing your property?" "That's correct." "All right, sir. I'm sending a unit to your location. Can you stay on the line?" "Yes, I can." Patricia's face had gone pale. "This is completely unnecessary. We're leaving right now." "Too late," I said. "The police are already on their way." "You're going to regret this," Patricia hissed, but she was already moving back toward her Honda. "Let's go, Melissa." "Madam," I called out to the dispatcher, "they're starting to leave now." "Ask them to stay at the location until the officer arrives," the dispatcher instructed. I relayed the message. "The dispatcher is asking you to stay until the police get here." "We don't have to do anything you say," Patricia said, but she had stopped walking. Melissa stood frozen between the two vehicles, looking like she wanted to disappear into the pavement. "You don't have to stay," I said, "but the police probably won't appreciate having to track you down." We all stood there in awkward silence for about 5 minutes, my truck still idling in the street, the illegal lights still flashing their red and blue patterns against the houses. A few neighbors had come out onto their porches to watch the spectacle. I recognized Tom and Jennifer from 3 houses down, and old Mr. Harrison from across the street. Great. This was exactly the kind of neighborhood drama I had always tried to avoid. The police cruiser arrived with its own legitimate emergency lights flashing. A young officer stepped out, adjusting his duty belt as he approached the scene. His nameplate read Officer Martinez. "Evening, folks," he said, his eyes immediately going to the flashing lights on the civilian vehicles. "Who called this in?" "I did," I said, turning off my truck's engine and stepping out. "I'm Eric Zimmerman. I live here." I pointed at the house behind the blocked driveway. "These 2 people are blocking my driveway and refusing to move." Officer Martinez looked at Patricia and Melissa. "And you 2 are?" "Patricia Whitmore, president of the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association," Patricia said, her voice regaining some of its earlier authority. We're conducting a security patrol of the neighborhood. The officer walked over to examine the lights on the vehicles. These your cars? Yes, Patricia said. You have permits for these emergency lights. Patricia hesitated. We don't need permits. They're not real emergency lights. They're just safety equipment for our HOA patrols. Officer Martinez looked back at her with an expression that suggested he had heard plenty of creative explanations in his career. Madam, these are red and blue flashing lights mounted on civilian vehicles. Under Ohio Revised Code Section 4513.17, only authorized emergency vehicles can display red or blue lights. What you're doing here is illegal. But we're not pretending to be police, Patricia protested. Our vests clearly say HOA. Doesn't matter, the officer said. The lights themselves are illegal. And from what dispatch told me, you were also blocking this gentleman's driveway. We were conducting official HOA business. So that's a yes, Officer Martinez interrupted. You were blocking his driveway, Melissa spoke up quietly. Yes, we were parked there. The officer nodded, pulling out a notepad. Okay, here's what's going to happen. First, you're going to remove those lights from your vehicles immediately. Second, you're both going to receive citations for improper use of emergency lighting. Third, madam, he looked at Patricia, you're getting an additional citation for obstructing a private driveway. This is ridiculous. Patricia's voice rose. We were protecting the neighborhood. There's been suspicious activity reported. What kind of suspicious activity? Officer Martinez asked. Well, there have been reports of unfamiliar vehicles in the area. Unfamiliar vehicles. The officer looked around at the quiet suburban street. You mean like people visiting their friends and family? No, I mean vehicles that don't belong to residents. And you thought the best response was to set up a roadblock with illegal lights. Patricia's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Officer Martinez turned to me. Mr. Zimmerman, do you want to press charges for the driveway obstruction? I thought about it. Part of me wanted to say yes, just to teach Patricia a lesson about abusing her limited authority. But I also knew that pressing charges would escalate an already tense relationship into outright warfare. I still had to live in this neighborhood. No charges, I said. I just want to be able to park my truck and go inside. Fair enough, the officer said, making notes. He looked back at Patricia and Melissa. You're both getting off easy here. Remove those lights. Move your vehicles, and I better not get another call about you two playing cop in this neighborhood. Understood. This is harassment, Patricia muttered, but she was already reaching for the magnetic light on her Honda's roof. We were just trying to keep the community safe. Then call the actual police next time you're concerned about something, Officer Martinez said. That's what we're here for. Melissa removed her light without protest and started toward the Explorer. Patricia yanked hers off with more force than necessary, nearly dropping it before shoving it into her back seat. Both women got into their respective vehicles and pulled away from my driveway, Patricia giving me a look of pure venom as she drove past. Officer Martinez handed me a small card. That's the incident number. If they give you any more trouble, call it in and reference this case. And just for documentation purposes, did they ask you for identification? Yeah, I said. Demanded to see my ID and vehicle registration. When I refused, she threatened to fine me $200. The officer shook his head. HOA boards. I swear some of them think they're running their own little kingdoms. Just so you know, they have zero authority to demand ID from anyone. They're not law enforcement. They're not even licensed security. They're just residents who volunteer for the board. That's what I tried to tell her, I said. Well, tonight should have made it clear. I'm going to note in my report that they were displaying emergency lights and demanding identification. If they keep it up, they could face more serious charges for impersonating peace officers. Thank you, officer. No problem. Sorry you had to deal with this after a long day at work. After he left, I finally pulled my truck into my driveway and shut it off. The sudden silence was almost overwhelming. I sat there for a moment, my hand still gripping the steering wheel, processing everything that had just happened. In all my years of dealing with Patricia's petty tyranny, this was by far the most bizarre encounter we had ever had. I grabbed my lunch box from the passenger seat and headed inside, locking the door behind me. My house felt like a sanctuary after the chaos outside. I tossed my keys on the kitchen counter and opened the fridge, but I had lost my appetite. Instead, I grabbed a beer and collapsed onto the couch, my mind racing despite my physical exhaustion. The next morning, I woke up to find a piece of paper tucked into my front door. It was a formal violation notice from the HOA, printed on official letterhead with Patricia's signature at the bottom. According to the notice, I was being cited for verbal harassment of HOA board members and interference with official HOA business. The fine was $500, due within 30 days. I stood on my front porch in my pajama pants and undershirt, reading the notice 3 times to make sure I was understanding it correctly. Patricia had actually fined me for calling the police on her illegal activities. The audacity was almost impressive. I went back inside and immediately called my neighbor, Jake Reynolds, who was a lawyer specializing in real estate and property law. We had become friendly over the years, bonding over our mutual frustration with the HOA's overreach. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Jake, it's Eric. Sorry to call so early, but I need some legal advice." "What did Patricia do now?" he asked with a laugh. I told him the whole story, from the blocked driveway to the illegal lights to the citation I had just found on my door. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. "She fined you after you called the cops on her," Jake said finally. $500. "That's retaliation, clear as day. Do you still have the incident number from last night?" I grabbed the card Officer Martinez had given me. "Yeah, got it right here." "Perfect. Here's what we're going to do. First, don't pay that fine. Second, write a formal response to the HOA board disputing the violation and citing last night's police report. Third, request a hearing in front of the full board, which is your right under the bylaws. And fourth, I'm going to send a letter on firm letterhead explaining that this appears to be retaliatory action, which is prohibited under Ohio HOA law." "Will that actually work?" I asked. "It should. Patricia might be drunk on her little bit of power, but she's not stupid. Once she realizes you're serious about fighting this legally, she'll probably back down. And if she doesn't, we can take this to the county court and she'll lose. No question." "Thanks, Jake, I appreciate it." "No problem, and Eric, document everything. Save that violation notice. Keep the police incident number. Take photos if anything else happens. If this escalates, we want a paper trail." I spent the rest of Saturday writing my response to the HOA violation. I kept it professional but firm, explaining exactly what had happened from my perspective and pointing out that I was the victim in the situation, not the perpetrator. I attached a copy of the police incident report, which I had requested and received via email that morning. The report clearly stated that Patricia and Melissa had been cited for illegal use of emergency lights and obstruction of a private driveway. On Monday, I submitted my response to the HOA management company that handled the neighborhood's administrative work. The woman at the front desk, Carol, gave me a sympathetic look as she stamped my documents received. "Between you and me," she said quietly. Patricia's gotten out of control lately. You're not the first person to push back on one of her fines. Really? I said. Carol glanced around to make sure no one else was in the office. Last month, she tried to fine the Andersons for having their recycling bin visible from the street, but it was trash day. The bins were at the curb because that's literally where they're supposed to be on trash day. The Andersons fought it, and the fine got thrown out. Why do people keep voting her in as president? I asked. Not enough people show up to the elections, Carol said with a shrug. Patricia and her friends always show up, so they always win. Most residents don't even know elections are happening. I thanked Carol and left, my mind working on this new information. Patricia had been running unopposed for years because of voter apathy. It was classic small-scale politics, the kind of thing that let petty tyrants maintain their grip on power. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later on a Thursday evening. Jake offered to come with me as representation, which I gratefully accepted. We arrived at the community center 15 minutes early to find Patricia already there, sitting at a long table at the front of the room with the other board members. I recognized them all from previous meetings. David Chen, the vice president, Susan Ramirez, the treasurer, and of course, Melissa Hoffman, the secretary, who wouldn't make eye contact with me. About 20 other residents were scattered throughout the room, more than I had expected. Apparently, word had gotten around about the incident, and people were curious about how the board would handle it. Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. We have several items on tonight's agenda, but first we'll address the dispute filed by Mr. Zimmerman regarding violation notice number 2025-047. She said my name with disdain, making it clear that this was an annoyance she would rather avoid. Jake stood up. For the record, I'm Jake Reynolds, attorney at law representing Mr. Zimmerman in this matter. Patricia's eyes narrowed. This is just a simple HOA hearing. There's no need for lawyers. Nevertheless, Mr. Zimmerman has the right to representation, which is explicitly stated in Section 12 of your bylaws, Jake said calmly. Shall we proceed? David Chen, the vice president, leaned forward. Let's hear Mr. Zimmerman's side of things. I stood up and gave a brief summary of what had happened, sticking to the facts and keeping my emotions out of it. I explained coming home from work, finding my driveway blocked, Patricia's refusal to move and her demand for identification, and my eventual decision to call the police. I mentioned the illegal emergency lights and the citations Patricia and Melissa had received. When I finished, Patricia immediately jumped in. Mr. Zimmerman is leaving out crucial details. He was verbally abusive and threatening. He refused to cooperate with a routine security check. He created a hostile environment that made it impossible for us to do our jobs. Your jobs, Jake said. Miss Whitmore, can you explain what legal authority you have to block someone's driveway and demand identification? We're elected board members with authority over all HOA matters, Patricia said. That's not an answer to my question, Jake pressed. Do you have any legal authority to demand identification from residents? Patricia's face flushed. We have the authority granted to us by the bylaws. I've read the bylaws, Jake said, pulling out a printed copy. There's no provision granting you authority to stop residents, demand identification, or block their driveways. In fact, the bylaws explicitly limit HOA authority to enforcing architectural guidelines and maintaining common areas. Susan Ramirez, the treasurer, spoke up. She was an older woman with gray hair and a kind face. I have to agree with Mr. Reynolds. I don't remember anything in the bylaws about conducting security patrols or stopping residents. We were responding to reports of suspicious activity, Patricia said, her voice rising defensively. It's our duty to protect the neighborhood. By blocking residents' driveways, David Chen asked. He looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. Patricia, I think we might have overstepped here. We didn't overstep anything. Patricia slammed her hand on the table. We have every right to ensure the safety and security of this community. If residents don't like that, they can file complaints, which apparently is exactly what Mr. Zimmerman has done instead of being grateful that we're willing to volunteer our time to keep everyone safe. The room had gone very quiet. Even Patricia seemed to realize she had lost her composure. Jake pulled out another document. This is the police report from that evening. It clearly states that you and Miss Hoffman were cited for illegal use of emergency lighting and obstruction of a private driveway. The officer's notes indicate that Mr. Zimmerman was cooperative and polite throughout the entire encounter, while you refused to move your vehicle even when asked multiple times. Melissa finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. That's true. Mr. Zimmerman was polite. He just wanted to park his truck. Patricia shot her a look that could have melted steel. Melissa, we've already discussed this. I'm sorry, Patricia, but I can't lie, Melissa said, looking miserable. I've been thinking about that night a lot. We shouldn't have blocked his driveway. We shouldn't have had those lights. The police officer made that very clear. You're out of order, Patricia snapped. Actually, she's not, David Chen said. She's answering questions about an incident she was involved in. That's exactly what we're here to discuss. Jake seized the moment. I'd also like to point out that the violation notice was issued the morning after Mr. Zimmerman called the police. The timing suggests this fine is retaliatory in nature, which is explicitly prohibited under Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.03. HOA boards cannot penalize residents for exercising their legal rights, which includes calling the police. This is absurd, Patricia said, but her voice had lost its edge. She knew she was losing. Susan Ramirez cleared her throat. I move that we dismiss the violation and refund any fines that may have been paid. I second that motion, David Chen said immediately. I haven't called for a vote yet, Patricia protested. Then call for a vote, Susan said firmly. Patricia looked around the table, clearly calculating her options. Finally, she said, all in favor of dismissing the violation. 3 hands went up, Susan's, David's, and Melissa's. Patricia sat with her arms crossed, refusing to participate in her own defeat. Motion passes, David announced. Mr. Zimmerman, your violation is dismissed, and we apologize for this misunderstanding. I'd like that apology in writing, Jake said, along with a written confirmation that the violation has been removed from Mr. Zimmerman's record. Fine, Patricia said through gritted teeth. Is there anything else? Actually, yes, Jake said. I'd like to address the issue of HOA board members conducting unauthorized security patrols with illegal emergency equipment. This could expose the HOA to significant liability if something were to happen. I strongly recommend that the board pass a resolution prohibiting such activities. I second that recommendation, said a voice from the audience. I turned to see old Mr. Harrison standing up. I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, and I've never felt unsafe until I saw those fake cop cars driving around with their lights flashing. That's not security, that's intimidation. Several other residents murmured in agreement. David Chen nodded. I think we should put that on the agenda for next month's meeting. We need to discuss appropriate boundaries for board member activities. This is unbelievable, Patricia said, gathering her papers. I've dedicated 15 years to this community, and this is the thanks I get. Fine. I'm done. I resign from the board effective immediately. She stood up and walked out of the room, leaving stunned silence in her wake. Melissa looked like she might cry. "Should someone go after her? Let her cool off," Susan said gently. "If she wants to resign, that's her choice. We'll deal with it at the next meeting." The hearing wrapped up shortly after that, with David Chen officially dismissing the meeting. Several residents came up to me afterward to express their support. Apparently, Patricia had made enemies throughout the neighborhood with her aggressive enforcement tactics. "I got fined $100 for having a wreath on my door past January," one woman told me. She said holiday decorations couldn't be visible after New Year's Day. "She tried to make me remove my vegetable garden," another man said. "Claimed it violated the landscaping standards, even though I had approval from the architectural committee." The stories went on and on. Patricia had been wielding the HOA rules like a weapon, using them to bully and control anyone who didn't meet her exacting standards. Jake and I walked out to the parking lot together. "That went better than expected," he said. "I thought we might have to threaten legal action, but the other board members seemed reasonable." "Do you think Patricia will actually resign?" I asked. "Probably not," Jake said with a laugh. "People like her don't give up power easily. She'll probably show up at the next meeting pretending nothing happened." But Jake was wrong. Patricia didn't show up at the next meeting, or the one after that. According to neighborhood gossip, she had submitted a formal resignation letter and was refusing to attend any HOA events. Some people thought she was just throwing a tantrum and would eventually come back. Others hoped she was gone for good. 3 months after the incident, the HOA held elections for a new president. I had been planning to vote and then go home, but Jake had other ideas. He nominated me. "Eric Zimmerman has shown that he's willing to stand up for residents' rights," Jake said during the nomination period. "He understands that the HOA exists to serve the community, not to police it. I think he'd make an excellent president." I tried to decline, but several other residents seconded the nomination enthusiastically. Before I knew what was happening, I was on the ballot. The election wasn't even close. I won with almost 70% of the vote, the highest turnout the neighborhood had seen in over a decade. People were clearly ready for a change in leadership. My first act as president was to pass a resolution prohibiting board members from conducting security patrols or using any kind of emergency lighting equipment. The resolution passed unanimously. My second act was to establish clearer guidelines for what constituted a legitimate violation and what didn't. No more fines for having recycling bins out on trash day or wreaths up a few days past the holidays. About 6 months into my tenure, I got a call from Carol at the management office. "Eric, you need to come down here. There's been a development with Patricia Whitmore." I drove over immediately, curious about what could possibly warrant an urgent in-person meeting. Carol met me at the door with a worried expression. "The county prosecutor's office called this morning," she said. "Patricia's been arrested." "Arrested? For what?" Carol handed me a printed news article. The headline read, "Local woman charged with impersonating police officer." According to the article, Patricia had been stopped by a state trooper on the highway while driving with red and blue emergency lights activated. When the trooper approached her vehicle, she had apparently shown him a fake police badge and claimed to be conducting an undercover investigation. The trooper, suspicious of her credentials, had called it in and discovered that Patricia had no law enforcement affiliation whatsoever. She was arrested on the spot. Further investigation revealed that she had been pulling over other drivers on multiple occasions, issuing fake citations for traffic violations. Some of these drivers had actually paid the fines by sending checks to an address Patricia provided, which turned out to be a P.O. box she had rented. She had apparently collected thousands of dollars through this scheme. "I can't believe this," I said, reading through the article twice. "She actually went full criminal." "There's more," Carol said, pulling up something on her computer. "I've been going through old HOA financial records, and I found some irregularities. It looks like Patricia may have been embezzling from the HOA budget." She showed me a spreadsheet detailing suspicious transactions from the past few years. Money allocated for landscaping that never happened. Payments to vendors that didn't exist. All told, it appeared that Patricia had stolen over $40,000 from the HOA over the course of her presidency. "We need to contact the police," I said. "Already done," Carol replied. "I called them as soon as I found this. They're sending a detective over this afternoon." The investigation into Patricia's activities expanded rapidly after that. The detective assigned to the case, a sharp woman named Detective Sarah Brennan, uncovered an even more extensive criminal enterprise than anyone had imagined. Patricia had been running variations of her fake police scam across 3 different counties, targeting out-of-state drivers who were unlikely to follow up on suspicious citations. She had created an entire fake police department, complete with letterhead, website, and phone number that went to a burner cell phone. The embezzlement from the HOA was just one piece of a larger pattern of financial fraud. Patricia had also been stealing from 2 other organizations she belonged to, a local charity and a church council. When the case finally went to trial 8 months later, I was called to testify about the night Patricia had blocked my driveway with the illegal emergency lights. The prosecutor, a stern man named Richard Foster, asked me to describe what had happened in detail. "She had these red and blue lights flashing on her vehicle," I explained from the witness stand. "She was wearing a vest that said HOA Patrol and had a fake badge. She demanded to see my identification and registration, just like a police officer would." "And did you comply with her request?" Foster asked. "No, I didn't. I knew she had no legal authority to demand those things." "What happened then?" "She threatened to fine me $200 for not complying with what she called a lawful HOA directive. When I said I was going to call the police, she and her associate tried to leave, but I asked them to stay until the real officers arrived." "And when the actual police officer arrived, what happened?" Officer Martinez immediately recognized that the emergency lights were illegal. He cited both Patricia and her associate, Melissa Hoffman, for improper use of emergency lighting. He also cited Patricia for blocking my driveway. Foster nodded, making notes on his legal pad. "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. No further questions." Patricia's defense attorney, a tired-looking public defender, tried to argue that his client had simply gotten carried away with her community duties and hadn't intended to impersonate law enforcement. But the evidence was overwhelming. The fake police department, the fake citations, the collected fines, the embezzled money. It all painted a picture of someone who had deliberately and systematically deceived people for financial gain. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: impersonating a peace officer, fraud, embezzlement, and theft by deception. The judge sentenced Patricia to 5 years in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution to all her victims, including the HOA. I attended the sentencing hearing, partly out of curiosity and partly because I felt I needed to see this through to the end. Patricia looked smaller somehow, diminished in her orange jail jumpsuit. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she stood up slowly. "I only wanted to keep my community safe," she said, her voice cracking. "Everything I did was for the neighborhood. I never meant for any of this to happen." The judge looked at her with an expression that mixed pity and disappointment. "Miss Whitmore, you didn't just want to keep your community safe. You wanted power and money, and you were willing to break the law to get both. You betrayed the trust of your neighbors, you stole from organizations that relied on you, and you terrorized innocent drivers by pretending to be a police officer. This court finds your actions reprehensible and deserving of significant punishment." After the sentencing, I stood outside the courthouse with Jake, both of us processing what had just happened. "Who would have thought?" Jake said. "HOA president to convicted felon, that's quite a fall." "I feel bad for her in a way," I said. "I think she genuinely believed she was doing the right thing at first. But then the power went to her head, and she couldn't stop herself from taking it further and further." "That's usually how it goes," Jake agreed. "People start with good intentions, but absolute power corrupts absolutely, even when that power is just being president of a homeowners association." Life in Riverside Meadows slowly returned to normal after that. I served as HOA president for 2 years, focusing on making the organization more transparent and responsive to residents' needs. We eliminated most of the petty rules that Patricia had enforced so zealously, keeping only the regulations that actually maintained property values and community safety. Violation notices dropped by over 80%, and resident satisfaction went way up according to our annual surveys. Melissa Hoffman, who had been Patricia's reluctant accomplice that night, remained on the board as secretary. She turned out to be a dedicated and conscientious board member once she was out from under Patricia's influence. She had testified against Patricia at trial, explaining that she had felt pressured and intimidated into going along with the patrol activities. "I knew it was wrong," she told me once over coffee after a board meeting, "but Patricia was so forceful, so absolutely convinced that she was right about everything. I didn't know how to stand up to her." "You stood up to her when it mattered," I said. "You told the truth at my hearing, even though you knew it would make Patricia angry." Melissa smiled slightly. "That was the moment I realized I had to stop letting her push me around. Thank you for that." The $40,000 Patricia had embezzled from the HOA was eventually recovered through the restitution process and the seizure of her assets. We used the money to make long overdue improvements to the neighborhood's common areas, including renovating the playground and resurfacing the community pool. About a year after Patricia's sentencing, I decided not to run for re-election as HOA president. I had done what I set out to do, reforming the organization and establishing better governance practices. It was time for someone else to take the reins. Susan Ramirez ran for president and won easily. She was exactly the kind of steady, reasonable leader the neighborhood needed. On my last day as president, I drove home from work along the same route I had taken that night almost 2 years earlier. I pulled into my driveway without obstruction, without flashing lights, without anyone demanding to see my identification. It was such a simple thing, being able to park in front of my own house without harassment, but I didn't take it for granted anymore. I thought about how a single decision to call the police instead of just backing down had led to uncovering a much larger criminal enterprise. If I had simply moved my truck to the street and parked there that night, Patricia would have continued her activities unchecked. More people would have been victimized. More money would have been stolen. Sometimes standing up to petty tyrants, even when you're exhausted and just want to go to bed, is exactly what needs to happen. The neighborhood had learned an important lesson too. Apathy and disengagement create opportunities for people like Patricia to seize control and abuse their authority. Now, HOA meetings regularly had 50 or 60 residents in attendance. People paid attention to what the board was doing. They asked questions, demanded accountability, and participated in elections. It was what community governance was supposed to look like. I grabbed my lunch box and headed inside, looking forward to a quiet evening. As I unlocked my front door, I saw Mr. Harrison out watering his lawn across the street. He waved, and I waved back. It was such an ordinary moment, the kind of peaceful suburban scene that Patricia had claimed to be protecting with her patrols and lights and fake authority. The irony was that she had been the biggest threat to the neighborhood's peace the whole time. Her authoritarian approach had created fear and resentment among residents, turning neighbors against each other over minor rule violations. Real community safety comes from people looking out for each other, not from self-appointed enforcers playing cop with fake badges. I settled onto my couch with a beer and turned on the television, finally able to relax. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Congratulations on finishing your term. You did good, man. The neighborhood is better because you didn't just let Patricia push you around." I smiled and typed back, "Thanks," though I never expected that calling the police on an HOA president would lead to uncovering a multi-county criminal operation. "Life is weird like that," Jake replied. "Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance have the biggest consequences." He was right. If I had known that night what my phone call would set in motion, I might have hesitated. But I had simply been a tired man wanting to park his truck after a long shift, unwilling to be bullied by someone who had no right to block my driveway. That simple act of standing up for myself had rippled outward in ways I never could have predicted. Several weeks later, I got a call from Detective Brennan, who had worked Patricia's case. "Mr. Zimmerman, I wanted to let you know that we've identified 12 additional victims of Miss Whitmore's fake traffic stop scheme. They're all being refunded the money they paid, and several of them specifically asked me to thank you." "Thank me? Why?" I asked. "Because you're the one who reported her to the police that night. If you hadn't done that, we never would have had the initial incident on record. When the state trooper arrested her on the highway, he searched our database and found your report. That's what tipped him off that this was a pattern of behavior, not just a one-time thing. Your report was the first domino." I sat down, absorbing this information. 12 more victims who got their money back because I had made a phone call on a random Thursday night. "I'm glad I could help," I said. "You did more than help," Detective Brennan said. "You stopped a predator." Patricia Whitmore was targeting vulnerable people, often elderly drivers or people from other countries who didn't understand the American legal system well enough to question her fake citations. She was counting on people being confused and intimidated. The money she stole probably doesn't seem like much to some people, but for many of her victims, those $200 or $300 fines were significant financial burdens. After we hung up, I thought about all the ways the situation could have gone differently. If I had been less exhausted and more willing to engage with Patricia's nonsense, maybe parking on the street and dealing with it later. If Officer Martinez had been less observant about the illegal lights, if Melissa had backed up Patricia's lies instead of telling the truth. So many small pivots that could have changed the outcome entirely, but things had happened the way they happened, and a criminal had been stopped. The neighborhood was safer and healthier. People felt empowered to participate in their community governance. And I had learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to accept unreasonable authority, even when it would be easier to comply. I walked out to my driveway and looked at the spot where Patricia's Honda had been parked that night, lights flashing, blocking my path home. The pavement was empty now, just ordinary concrete reflecting the afternoon sun. No fake cops, no harassment, no power-hungry HOA president demanding identification. Just my driveway, my house, my peaceful slice of suburban life. I thought about Patricia sitting in prison, probably still convinced that she had been right all along, that she had only been trying to help. That was perhaps the saddest part of the whole story. She had become so intoxicated by her tiny bit of authority that she couldn't see how far over the line she had stepped. She had gone from neighborhood volunteer to criminal without ever recognizing the transition. The neighborhood block party that summer was the best attended in years. Someone had set up a grill station, kids were running through sprinklers, and neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before were chatting and laughing together. Susan Ramirez, the new HOA president, gave a brief speech thanking everyone for their involvement and participation. "This is what community looks like," she said. "Not rules and fines and punishment, but people coming together to make our neighborhood a better place for everyone. We've had a difficult couple of years, but we've come through it stronger and more united." People applauded, and someone cranked up the music. I stood there with my beer, watching kids play and adults mingle, and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This was what we had been fighting for, this simple right to live peacefully in our own community without fear of arbitrary authority or harassment. Jake wandered over with his wife, Sarah, and their 2 young daughters. "You look contemplative," he said. "Just thinking about how different things are now," I replied. "You made that difference happen," Sarah said. "When Jake told me what Patricia had done to you, I was furious. And then to find out she was running this whole criminal operation. It's terrifying to think what might have happened if you had just let it go." "I almost did let it go," I admitted. "I was so tired that night, part of me just wanted to park on the street and forget about it." "But you didn't," Jake said. "That's what matters." One of their daughters tugged on Jake's arm, wanting him to come watch her jump rope skills. He smiled apologetically and let himself be dragged away, leaving me alone with my thoughts again. A couple I didn't recognize approached me hesitantly. "Are you Eric Zimmerman?" the man asked. "That's me," I said. "We just moved in last month," the woman said. "We wanted to introduce ourselves and thank you. Carol at the management office told us what you did, standing up to the old HOA president. We actually chose this neighborhood specifically because we heard the HOA had become more reasonable." We chatted for a few minutes, and they told me about moving from a neighborhood in Cleveland where the HOA had been nightmarish, with constant violations and arbitrary rules. They had researched carefully before buying in Riverside Meadows, wanting to make sure they weren't jumping from one problematic situation to another. "The reviews online are so positive now," the woman said. "Everyone talks about how fair and responsive the board is." That's exactly what we were looking for. After they wandered off to meet other neighbors, I realized that the changes we had made were actually attracting better residents to the neighborhood. People who wanted to be part of a real community, not just a collection of houses governed by fear and arbitrary rules. Property values had gone up, not because of strict enforcement, but because people genuinely wanted to live here. As the sun set and the block party wound down, I helped fold up tables and clean up trash. It was the kind of voluntary community work that Patricia had always tried to mandate and enforce, but people were doing it naturally because they cared about their neighborhood and each other. I drove home that night thinking about the strange journey from that confrontation in my driveway to where we were now. Sometimes life puts you in a position where you have to make a choice: comply with unreasonable authority or stand up for what's right. I had chosen to stand up, not knowing where it would lead, just knowing that what Patricia was doing was wrong. The consequences had been far greater than I ever imagined. A criminal caught, money recovered, a neighborhood transformed, lives made better. All because I had been too tired and too annoyed to let an HOA president bully me in my own driveway. That night, I slept soundly, peacefully, knowing that my truck was safely parked where it belonged, in my own driveway, with no flashing lights or fake cops or power-hungry HOA presidents anywhere in sight. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance really do matter. Sometimes refusing to be pushed around, even when you're exhausted and just want to go to bed, is exactly the right thing to do. And sometimes, just sometimes, standing up to a petty tyrant leads to exposing a real criminal, making your neighborhood a better place, and learning that ordinary people have more power than they think when they're willing to use it. That was the real lesson from my encounter with Patricia Whitmore and her illegal lights. Not that HOA boards are inherently bad, but that unchecked authority always corrupts, and regular citizens have both the right and the responsibility to push back when that authority is abused. The neighborhood continued to thrive under Susan's leadership. She implemented regular community forums where residents could voice concerns and suggestions. The board became more transparent, publishing detailed financial reports and meeting minutes. Violation notices were reserved for actual problems that affected property values or safety, not petty aesthetic preferences. I stayed involved as a regular resident, attending meetings when I could and volunteering for community projects. I had learned that engagement matters, that paying attention to local governance prevents the kind of power concentration that had allowed Patricia to operate unchecked for so long. Years later, I would sometimes drive past the community center where that crucial hearing had taken place, where Patricia had stormed out in a rage after being challenged. I would remember the shock on everyone's faces, the sense that something fundamental had shifted in that moment. One person's refusal to accept abuse had given others permission to speak up about their own experiences with Patricia's tyranny. And I would think about Patricia herself, serving her sentence, hopefully learning from her mistakes. I bore her no ill will, despite everything. She had been a cautionary tale about what happens when someone confuses authority with power, when they start believing their own importance. In the end, she had victimized herself as much as anyone else, destroying her reputation and freedom for the sake of playing pretend cop with fake lights and a costume shop badge. But that night when I pulled into my driveway to find those flashing lights blocking my path, I couldn't have known any of that. I was just a tired man who wanted to park his truck and go to bed, who refused to be pushed around by someone with no legitimate authority. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. One person at the right moment, saying no to unreasonable demands. The neighborhood I lived in now was proof that communities can heal and grow after removing toxic leadership. We had moved from fear to cooperation, from arbitrary enforcement to reasonable governance, from isolation to connection. And it had all started with a simple phone call to the police, made by an exhausted factory worker who just wanted to get home after a long shift. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about HOA governance or standing up to bullies, though those were certainly part of it. The real lesson was about civic responsibility, about the idea that we all have a role to play in making our communities better. Whether that means calling out abuse of authority, volunteering for neighborhood projects, or simply showing up to vote in HOA elections, every small action contributes to the larger whole. Patricia Whitmore had shown us what happens when people disengage and leave governance to those who seek power for its own sake. The neighborhood's transformation showed what happens when people re-engage and take responsibility for their community. Both lessons were valuable, though one had been far more painful to learn than the other. I never regretted making that phone call, even though it had led to complications and stress I hadn't anticipated. Doing the right thing often comes with costs, but the alternative, letting abuse and corruption continue unchecked, was far worse. My small act of resistance had mattered, had made a real difference in real people's lives. That knowledge was worth all the trouble it had caused. And so life continued in Riverside Meadows, peaceful and normal, with an HOA that served its residents instead of ruling over them, with neighbors who looked out for each other instead of reporting minor violations, with a sense of community that Patricia's authoritarian approach had nearly destroyed, but ultimately, through her downfall, had helped to rebuild. Sometimes the worst situations lead to the best outcomes, not despite the crisis, but because of it. We had learned, grown, and emerged stronger on the other side.